Welcome to episode 19 of Let's Rage Together, a podcast where two friends talk about the politics of total liberation and related topics.
We annihilated the world before your very ears.
You can't handle the truth.
Happy New Year and new decade, everyone. I hope this is going to be a great year for all of you. In this episode, we are getting into a bit of listener feedback, and then we'll be giving our opinions on two documentaries, The Invisible Vegan and The Animal People.
If you have any feedback or questions, you can email us at mail@letsragetogether.co.za, or you can message us on Facebook or Instagram, where you'll find us with the handle Let's Rage Together Podcast. If you'd like to support what we do, we would really appreciate it if you gave us a rating and review on iTunes or wherever you listen to us, and share our episodes with your friends. If you would like to make a financial contribution, you can visit our website www.letsragetogether.co.za and click on the support tab, where you'll find links to make a once-off donation on PayPal or a recurring donation for $1 a month or more on Patreon. And on that note, we'd like to give a shout out and a huge thank you to Marina and Denise, who both gave us a once-off donation on PayPal.
And Marina actually sent us a message recently about how her and a kind of animal rights collective she's part of in Greece moved away from Anonymous for the Voiceless and started their own new collective doing a lot of anti-speciesist action and stuff like that. So we can share a link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, it sounds awesome, and I'm keen to hear updates about that, Marina.
I would say the name of the group, but it is in Greek. I don't know how to read it.
It will be embarrassing.
Sorry.
So yeah, thank you, Marina and Denise, and also our latest Patreon supporters, Shana, who has a YouTube channel, The Raw and You, which is worth checking out. Also Craig J and Kobe.
Kobe Edge. He's a buddy of mine from Berlin and works at Iron Cobra Tattoo. So if you are in Berlin, check them out.
Yeah, so thank you to all of our supporters, even the ones who support us through listening and sharing episodes. We really appreciate all of it.
Yeah, thanks, folks.
And before we carry on, I just want to apologize for how terrible my voice sounds. I hope it's not too annoying and it won't be like this next episode.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Taryn and I also play in a band together, and she pushed it a little bit too hard last night, and that's why she sounds like she does. So you don't actually have to feel sorry for her.
Actually, I sound like this because I'm just a bad vocalist, so I shredded my throat. But also, it was
Not
our
true.
first practice of the year, so it was exciting.
I guess so.
So I was just too amped, okay?
Yes, okay.
But I apologize. I'll try let Pete speak more than me today.
No, please don't do that. But fine, I'll start. So first up today, we have some episode follow-up and listener feedback. In last episode 18, in the Bad and Rad section, we discussed the documentary The Game Changers. We made mention of the exclusion of some female athletes, including ultramarathon runner Fiona Oakes, and mentioned that we weren't sure why they would decide to exclude her. A couple of listeners have brought to our attention since then about a post on Fiona's Facebook page, which sheds some light on the issue. So we'll post a link to that in the show notes, but for now, I'm just going to read some of it. But basically what happened is that in 2013, James Wilkes asked Fiona if he could include her in his new film, The Game Changers. He couldn't get the funding he needed and so postponed it. And then in 2016, he contacted her again to let her know that he had secured James Cameron as a funder. So they went to her sanctuary and they filmed her running and taking care of her non-human animals there, the Tower Hill Stables Animal Sanctuary, which has over 500 non-human animal residents. They don't have any staff or volunteers there. She does all the work herself and her partner helps on the weekend. The film crew were really impressed by the fact that she is such an accomplished runner, and also that she pretty much fundraises for herself for the sanctuary with her family and partner and a few donations, which they assured her would no longer be an issue once the film came out because she would get a lot more support. So because of this promise, they double checked that she was going to be in it, and the James Wilkes and the crew said, to quote the post, it said they answered in the affirmative, even saying that they would not have spent the huge sums of money it took to bring 14 film crew from the USA if they hadn't intended her lifetime's work to be included. So yeah, I mean, I guess they thought it was worth it, because she's such an accomplished ultramarathon runner, runs a sanctuary, fundraisers for the sanctuary. But then in January 2018, a few days before the film was shown at the Sundance Festival, a generic email was sent to her saying essentially, sorry you didn't make the final cut. So that's basically what happened. She was supposed to be in it. In the last episode, we said it would have been cool if she was included. So it's cool to find this out. So that just really sucks because of the hope that they gave Fiona and her family for their sanctuary. You know, it would have probably really relieved a lot of the pressure that they have to fundraise each month. Also, she's an incredible athlete and accomplished ultramarathon runner, which is made more amazing considering that she got there after a debilitating condition that she had when she was much younger, where she was told she'd be lucky to ever walk again. And the fact that she's been vegan for more than 45 years. So she's essentially built her entire physiology on a plant-based diet, which is not like any of the other people in the Game Changers. I mean, that guy, what's his name? Nimoy.
Yeah.
He's been vegetarian since birth, but it's not really the same thing. Like, Fiona's been vegan since she was 6 years old.
Mm.
And then on top of this, she has to find a way to raise £12,000 per month. That is like a shitload of money.
It's a lot of money, yeah.
And so I really don't understand why she wasn't included. Honestly, she is way more impressive to me than most of the athletes in the Game Changers.
I personally think, and this is entirely my own assumption and could be wrong, but I think the fact that she runs a sanctuary and that a lot of her running is activism driven, like she wants to run to raise awareness about animal rights, I think that might have not sat well with what the Game Changers was trying to do, because it was very palatable to the mainstream. It was very health focused, it was very diet focused, and I feel like maybe she would have been, she would have brought in ethics that was kind of uncomfortable for the documentary, which I think they obviously wouldn't say that overtly, but that's my personal opinion. Like, she didn't sit well with the narrative.
No, I agree with you. Yeah, probably would have made it like more challenging for the public to digest. Well, at least the crew, the film crew, or whoever was in charge of this thought that, you know. So if you encourage people to watch the Game Changers, then I think that you should also be telling them about Fiona Oakes and encouraging them to donate to Tower Hill Stables Animal Sanctuary.
And we'll give a link to that in the show notes as well. So if you can support her in any way, then please do that as well.
Yeah. So Fiona does have a Patreon account, and it's pretty shocking. A little bit earlier today, I compared it to some other high-profile, in quotes, activists. So if you compare Earthling Ed, for example, he has 1,358 patrons and earns $7,325 per month. That's 105,400 Rand, 6,500 euros, 5,600 pounds per month just from Patreon. So that's not to mention all his other sources of income. Fiona has 41 patrons and earns $429 per month, which is 6,000 Rand, 380 euros, 320 pounds.
I mean, you can't even live off of that, like, as a normal functioning human, never mind looking after 500 animals.
I mean, what the fuck? Like, I don't know. It was like shocking to me to compare that.
Shame.
Like,
Ed must have a hard life though, eh?
Jeez, what? He has so much money.
So much money.
So Fiona is this incredible athlete, been vegan almost 5 decades, looks after a sanctuary essentially alone. So it's all that work, plus fundraising £12,000 per month somehow, which speaks a lot louder than words in terms of advocating for the potential benefits of a plant-based diet, and runs the sanctuary like alone and fundraises alone with the help of some people. Like, how does Ed even compare? She's way more impressive and deserving than him, in my opinion. But I don't know, maybe it has something to do with the fact that she's also a 54-year-old woman.
Yeah, and just as a side note, we got an email from Brad, who's actually my brother, and he doesn't really follow what's happening in the vegan movement or whatever, and he said that we sounded a bit harsh in the last episode talking about Ed. So just to put it in perspective, this is our issue. It's not about, you know, people using the money they have to live their lives, like everyone has bills to pay or whatever, but he said that we came across kind of harsh about Ed, like he can spend his money on what he wants, but the fact of the matter is it's just a massive amount of money, and yes, he's doing, I mean, a fair amount of
Well-
stuff for animal rights, which is debatable.
He talks at Google and
Yeah. He does talks and
makes YouTube videos.
uses activism van and has a podcast and stuff.
Yeah.
But he doesn't promote...
He does a lot of stuff that people who don't do it full time do.
Yes, and he doesn't promote other activists as far as I've seen. He doesn't really speak out about any other kind of injustice. And
He seems fine to not challenge anyone calling him vegan Jesus or like as like the savior.
And I just feel like if you're getting that amount of money, if I was doing a lot of activism and getting support the way he is, I mean, you can't control what people choose to support, like on Patreon or whatever, and that's their choice. And I think there is some validity to people wanting to donate to an activist, a quote-unquote activist, because maybe they don't have the time or the capacity to do what they would like to do, and they see those actions being done by someone else and they think, okay, I can't do that myself, but I can support someone who is. I think that's totally valid. I do think there's something to be said for that being a bit of a cop-out, like being able to say, oh, I support what Ed does, like living vicariously through him.
Therefore, I don't need to do anything myself.
Yeah, when there might be a lot that you could do. So in a sense, I see why some people would want to support him and that people have the right to support whoever they want. But as the recipient of those funds, like if that was me, I would feel unethical getting that amount of money.
Yeah.
And not being transparent about it, not saying, okay, I use X amount for my living expenses because everyone has to live in this shitty capitalist society. That's understandable. But to what point? Like,
yeah, I mean, just from Patreon, that's like really a shitload of money.
it's a lot of money. And
And
why
then
not give some away to other activists that aren't getting the recognition, or at least share their work?
And again, he gets funding from other sources too. We aren't 100% sure, on all the sources. And I don't think... It's one of the things that kind of bugs me about him is that it's not very transparent what he does with the money, or there's like, it's hard to point out like a problem, but it's just that the problem is that he's like silent on a lot of stuff. He's not at all vocal about like being consistently anti-oppression. You never hear him talk about slaughterhouse workers and like conditions that are associated with animal exploitation or animal agriculture that affect other human beings. He it looks like he gets funding from Blue Horizon as well, and I think it's just really unfair that obviously the reason why he gets this much funding is because any new vegans or people who come in will find him like very quickly because he's really good at marketing himself. If you look at Fiona's lifestyle, on her site she talks about running like 80 to 100 miles per week training for her running. And if anyone runs, you know how much time that takes. Plus looking after sanctuary alone and fundraising for the sanctuary. So when does she have time to like sit on Instagram and pay marketing teams and stuff to like do her social media and promote it? Like, to me, it seems like really unfair. Like, just because you can be good at marketing and have time to market yourself.
Although I just want to interject that he's not only good at marketing himself, but he pays someone to market for him.
Yes, exactly.
He's got the same PR agency as
J.K. Rowling.
J.K. Rowling.
To me, that's absolutely ridiculous.
He's literally a celebrity. And surely he knows how well known he is, and he knows that he benefits from white privilege and male privilege, and that he's given a platform largely because of how society is set up. Yes, he's good at debating animal rights, and he's obviously good at what he does, but he also is benefiting from the way society just lifts up white dudes.
Yeah.
He's like part of this group of these dudes who are not in any way special in what they're doing, but are getting all of the recognition and all of the support. Why not just share the work of like Food Empowerment Project and Christopher Sebastian and like
an unoffensive animal and people doing direct action and stuff.
Fiona freaking Oakes. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Just share stuff that's being done.
And
also get so that the new vegans can at least be like, oh, there are other people who also need support.
Yeah, and also the fact like that it bugs me a lot. How does it make sense that in a movement meant to be about non-human animals, that animal sanctuaries struggle so much to just get by each month, while individual humans like Ed have so much money. Like, it would be really cool if people like Ed pay forward some of their funds to the very victims and individuals they're fighting for, or at least promote activists, like you said, like Fiona Oakes, instead of just pushing themselves the entire time. Like, I, for one, would much rather see a photo of Fiona running in the desert on Instagram than a photo of James Aspie's fucking abs while he's enjoying his holiday in Bali taking selfies with slaughtered pigs. Anyway.
Yeah, and in addition to that, like, Ed has spoken about opening a sanctuary as well, which is great. Like, more sanctuaries is rad for animals. But at the same time, there are already sanctuaries helping non-human animals. If you have a shitload of money, why not help the sanctuaries that are already there and already struggling? Get them on their feet. And then if you can open another sanctuary, that's cool.
Exactly.
But there's already infrastructure there. Like,
Yeah.
I've always actually had a problem with this with a lot of like NPO sector type people and organizations, where you have people who want to do something, and this is going on a bit of a tangent, I realize that, but you have people wanting to do something and they get amped about it and they're like, oh, I also want to start an organization, or I also want to help these kind of individuals, or I also want to do this thing. So they start new organizations. And I've always thought, like, worldwide, nonprofits are struggling hugely with resources, human resources and financial resources and all the resources that they need. And yet when people want to help, often they think of starting new things when there are already so many projects there that could benefit from more input and more resource and more support. So why not pick up what's there already, you know? And I think this is a good example where you have someone with influence and you have someone with money who has a goal to start an organization very much like ones that already exist and are struggling.
Exactly.
Why not get the organizations and sanctuaries that are already there operating optimally, not just struggling month to month and not
Yes.
able to actually do their job properly because they're just worried about money? Doesn't make sense to me.
Exactly, I agree. I mean, even Ed's restaurant, Unity Diner. If I was in London, I would way rather visit Black Cat Hackney than go to Unity Diner. Like, Unity is just like 100% animal rights, it's like single issue veganism focused. When you get like Black Cat, which is also 100% vegan, but it's also a worker and cooperatively run space where they have a lot of events dealing with other stuff as well.
And very delicious food.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, I think that's enough about that discussion. And moving on to some listener feedback from Ellie, who asked us to discuss why the vegan flag is controversial. So we're just going to give some of our personal thoughts. I think we've mentioned briefly in a long time ago episode that we don't really agree with it, or we alluded to that, but we didn't have a discussion. So from my perspective, I think having a vegan flag creates a kind of separation, and it makes it seem a little bit culty / nationalist. And personally, I think it's important to distinguish between flags and symbols. So for example, you have the feminist symbol, which represents a set of values and principles that communicate ideas about social dynamics. So for me, a symbol can be really powerful because you can show a symbol and it communicates a set of values that you aspire to or that you live by, and everyone can kind of understand where you're coming from. But for me, flags often imply a kind of arbitrary membership. Like if you think of national flags, it's quite random that your birthplace dictates like your flag of origin, which is just arbitrary, like it's just by chance. So yeah, I just think that distinction is important, and I don't really like the idea of a flag.
Yeah, I agree. I think that also having a flag, what you said about the nationalist thing, that's true. Like, we don't need flags. They come from the same type of thinking as borders and nations, which, like you said, it's arbitrary, and those are like essentially like racist institutions. Like the whole third world has to get visas to travel the first world, but not the other way around. Having a flag comes from that same mode of thinking and that same rhetoric of nations and borders, and it denotes territory. So I agree with you that it is like a divisive, like separatist kind of thing to have a flag for something like veganism, when like veganism is already like really tiny. And with the flag, you seem to me, it looks like you're creating this kind of vegan island, when veganism should be about this kind of broader politics of anti-oppression. Like, for example, I believe anarchists should be vegan because of their inherent politics of anti-hierarchy. So you would apply that anti-hierarchical thinking to species. So why would they need to have like a flag for something that's already part of their politics? Do you know what I mean? It doesn't really make sense to me. And I agree with you about the symbols, you know, but I mean, what would you say if people say, yeah, okay, but cool, that's fine with national style flags and whatever, but what about like pride flags or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point, and it's not one that I immediately thought of when I was thinking about the vegan flag. But I think it's important to distinguish between the type of flag that the pride flag is versus the vegan flag, because if you think about what the pride flag is, it stands for like a personal identity, but also a sense of acceptance. And it's not something that's this kind of club that you choose to join. Whereas veganism is like this, I don't know how to phrase it, but kind of like a chosen identity. But it's also, veganism is not about vegans.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going to say as well. The main thing is that it seems to center humans.
Yeah, a vegan flag isn't relevant to anything about us personally or who we are as individuals, because it shouldn't be about us. It's about animal rights. And I think a vegan flag decenters non-human animals and makes it seem like this club people should want to join. And I think it harms efforts to normalize veganism and emphasizes humans as the focus of the movement rather than non-humans. Whereas with the pride flag, it's very different, because you're speaking about an oppressed group and referring to that group of people.
Yes.
Vegans are not oppressed. Like,
yeah, exactly. That's what I was also thinking. Like, the pride flag can be used by LGBTQIA plus people as well as their allies. Like, and also it can kind of symbolize a safe space. Like, if a restaurant is flying a pride flag outside of it, then like homosexual people or anyone on that spectrum knows, like, cool, they're probably friendly to me, and so I can go into that place. I guess you could have a similar thing with the vegan flag being used to show they have vegan options or something, but you can also write like, we have vegan options, or it's a vegan menu or something.
and the little green V with the leaf is like,
Yes,
well
exactly.
known as like vegan friendly.
Exactly, because the
know.
original vegan society created that symbol, and like you said, the symbol is already there. We don't need a flag. So the symbol could work in the same way, like you were saying, the feminist symbol works. And the vegan flag isn't really doing the same thing, like you said, as the pride flag or any other flag like that, because it's more creating a division of like us and them, like vegan, non-vegan, when it isn't about us. It isn't about humans. Like we've been bringing up a lot lately, Roger Yates talking about the focus being non-human animals, but the scope being much bigger. And one of the main issues I have as well is, like you said, the pride flag is essential because it's an integral part of a movement that's against oppression of human beings. The vegan flag, if people are going to argue that it's being used in the same way, is making humans vegans, seem like oppressed victims. And vegans aren't an oppressed group. And thinking that we are, again, decenters the focus on non-human animals.
Yeah, that's essentially what I was trying to say, in that the pride flag is denoting essentially pride in an identity that has been suppressed by society as something to not be proud of, something to be discriminated against. And like you say, or like we've both mentioned, it's about the actual oppressed group. I mean, if flying a vegan flag, who are you talking about then? You're talking about vegans who are not oppressed. You know, we have nothing to be proud of.
Yeah.
We have nothing to fly a flag for, to say we are somehow having to stand up for ourselves. We're not standing up for ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
That's pretty much my views in a nutshell. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Pete.
No, not really. I mean, I think we've essentially are saying, like, in a nationalist mode of thinking, it doesn't make sense because it creates division. in a pride way of thinking, it doesn't make sense because it censors humans and isn't about the humans themselves. Like, vegans are not an oppressed group, like we said, and it's also not something that, like, you know, say you get a gay person who uses the flag because they're like, this is who I am and I can be proud of who I am. You know, that's not something vegans should be saying. Like, I'm vegan and I'm proud of that, or something like that. You've just, like, what is that saying? You haven't given anything up. You've just stopped taking what was never yours to begin with, whether you're talking about animals used in any way, not just in food. I don't want to be like single issue about it. But I also love that conversation we had earlier with a friend this week, where when I visited the Food Fight vegan grocery store in Portland, they have these t-shirts that on the back it says, vegan means I'm trying to be less shit. And I love that sentiment of, like, I'm not a superhero or whatever at the moment the mainstream vegans want to push. You're just trying to be less shit. Like, so I don't think the vegan flag is really relevant to be used when you already have the word vegan. You're, like you said, already have the symbol from the original UK Vegan Society. So what's the point of it?
Yeah, I think it's kind of redundant, and I think it does. We've already alluded to the separation idea, but if you think of it from like a non-vegan perspective, if you are considering veganism and only really discovering the politics of veganism, and then you see this flag, it kind of, to me, creates another barrier to exploring oppression in general and speciesism and animal rights, because it's kind of creating an identity where people have to now also think, do I want to be part of this group of people who fly this flag? And I think that's really unnecessary, and kind of, it's creating an obstacle for people to consider speciesism.
Yeah, I agree. But vegans keep doing these kind of things. You know what I mean? Like, coming up with the flag, coming up with the fork, like, wrapped around your wrist for Liberation Pledge. Like, why do we need all of these new symbols and signifiers of veganism and stuff, you know?
Yeah, in a way, I think for some people it might be an attempt to normalize veganism, like the Liberation Pledge we've spoken about before, and it might be a way of almost forcefully saying, I'm not going to eat with you if you're eating non-vegan food. Well, it's not really food. And I think it's, in a way, for some people, an attempt at normalizing veganism, like what you're doing is abnormal, so I'm going to normalize veganism. But I feel like it's doing the opposite of that. It's creating divisions that is not normalizing anything.
Yeah.
It's creating this barrier where people just think it's extreme, or it's, you know, any of the stereotypical
I'm totally
arguments.
anti the Liberation Pledge, and I'm glad it seems like people have stopped talking about that stuff.
I don't know. I think there are still some people who are.
Yeah, I don't think that's helpful at all, along with the vegan flag. But anyway, maybe I'm just being grump.
Maybe. But anyway, we also have some more follow-up. We got a message regarding our last episode where we briefly discussed Lonely Vegans. If you're not familiar with them, they're an Instagram account. You can just search Lonely Vegans and you'll find them. But we were basically speaking about different forms of activism and how they come across to non-vegans specifically. And we were speaking about their potential effects as well. So we had been asked to look at a specific post made by Lonely Vegans. And that is the post that we focused on as an example of a specific type of activism with specific messaging accompanying the post. And the post was basically them going in to a farm and spending time with 2 pigs and documenting their living conditions. So the feedback we got was that the discussion that we had came across as very unfair. For example, one point that I had made in that discussion was that it may not be necessary for them to be in the photos that they take. And the reason that I mentioned that was because they had received criticism that we mostly disagree with. They'd received criticism about taking quote-unquote selfies, which neither of us think that they actually are doing. But I basically said that we disagree with that criticism, but it might not be necessary for them to be in the photos for it to be as powerful. And Pete had mentioned that he kind of thinks that them being in the photos can be powerful in the way that like ALF footage can be really inspiring sometimes, seeing animals being liberated. And I had said that in this case, I don't think it's the same because it's not really the same kind of intervention, to just sit there with them versus liberating them.
So in Terence's ALF, she's talking about the Animal Liberation Front. It was also pointed out to us that they do liberations often, and that our discussion downplayed the work they do, and that it's often only possible to save babies, if any non-human animals, which of course we understand. There's a lot of planning and logistics involved in liberations. So we weren't criticizing them for not rescuing or liberating the animals. We are well aware that it's not that simple, especially when it comes to animals such as adult pigs, for example. We were only addressing the idea of sitting and suffering with them. We also have an issue with the people criticizing them for not liberating those pigs. We acknowledge that it's devastating to leave animals behind.
Yeah, so it was also noted that the story of them sitting with Walter and Dylan, which is the two pigs that we mentioned, is the same as spending time with shelter dogs. So I agree to a point, but I also disagree in that the difference is that with these animals, there's no possibility for adoption or a better life. They're going to get killed. And it's not kind of lifting their spirits and hoping they find a good home and have a happy ending. But I do definitely take that point, and I do think that there is value as a standalone act in spending time with animals and providing them with some comfort. But I don't think it's quite the same as going to spend time with like dogs at a shelter.
Yeah, I agree. It was also mentioned that we should have had their back more, especially now since they got raided and have lost a lot of equipment and will have legal fees coming up. We just want to mention that at the time we recorded, their page was down. This was acknowledged in the email, and we didn't know about the raid or why the page had been taken down. We can see now how the timing of the discussion may have seemed insensitive, and of course, if we had had that context at the time of recording, the discussion probably would have been quite different.
Yeah, so just to kind of re-emphasize, we were also just talking about the importance of not allowing misanthropy or burnout to take over, again, in the context of how the resulting messaging could come across to non-vegans. And we were also talking about the importance of self-care and how it makes us more effective as activists. So we weren't trying to criticize them directly for everything they do. We were just looking at specific elements and how, generalizing that to other people doing similar activism, just points to consider, basically.
Yeah, so we basically just want to clarify that we do find Lonely Vegans really inspiring. We follow their accounts with all of our accounts, like Let's Rage Together and our personal accounts. And we're really not trying to tear them down in any way. Any person willing to risk their safety and freedom for victims of oppression is someone who should be seen with a huge amount of respect. And the stuff that they do is really inspiring. And we really feel for the raid and what they went through and the trauma and difficulties that they must be dealing with. So hopefully that clarifies our position.
Yeah, so we just wanted to kind of clear that up and make sure everyone knows that we weren't trying to attack them or anything like that. We were just looking at one post that they made from a kind of critical viewpoint and
relevant to the question asked by the listener.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we weren't in any way trying to criticize everything that they do. It was just about that one post, and we do think that what they do is really valuable and inspiring.
Yeah, and we think that you should go and follow the Lonely Vegans. We'll post a link to their social accounts in the show notes too.
Yeah, for sure. Then we also got a rad email from listener Ayana from London, who said some really nice things to us, but she also inspired us. So we wanted to read part of her email and share her ideas with you all. I also just want to give a virtual high five to her because she's 14 and she puts our past 14-year-old selves to shame with her ideas.
Yeah.
So this is some of what she said.
At the moment, I organize tri-annual arts events called Vegan Arts Night. The purpose is to raise money for non-human animal sanctuaries and grassroots activism organizations. For example, in January, we have an event raising funds for our local hunt saboteurs. At each event, vegan artists perform spoken word, music, poetry, and do speeches about anti-speciesism/veganism/non-human animal rights. And as well as that, we have artists selling their artwork on stalls. And for the first time at our next event, we have an anti-speciesism panel. Anyway, the point of the event is to create a safe space for activists to wind down and have fun. I feel like much of the time we are so engrossed in activism that we forget about ourselves. I think that art is a really healing thing to do because you can express your emotions and analyze how you feel and so on, which brings me onto my main point. the Anti-Speciesism Arts Collective.
She goes on to say, the Anti-Speciesism Arts Collective is a project I want to launch to help activists practice self-care. I think there are lots of activism opportunities around, or at least more than there are self-care. And I think this is so vital to the sustainability of any justice movement. There are lots of good activists not able to do activism for one reason or other, and I think we need solid support systems in place to help each other because, let's face it, it's hard times. I would love to hear your opinions and advice on this and any ideas or questions you have. I know it's a bit random, but there aren't many anti-speciesists out there. We think this is a really great idea, and if you're interested, you can find out more about what Ayana is wanting to do at antispeciesistarts.weebly.com, which we'll also leave in the show notes. And if you're in London, please keep an eye out for these events and show some support if you can.
Ayana's trying to make me cry. It's so fucking cool.
Very cool.
Like, to start an anti-speciesism arts collective, that is super inspiring. And like, really doing this at 14 years old, you have like cool future activism ahead of you, you know?
And the messaging on the site is really cool. The ideas are really cool.
Yeah, I wish I was even like a quarter of the way here when I was 14 years old.
Yeah, same.
I mean, there's many adults and mainstream activists who don't even understand this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So keep at it, and we hope that it's all a huge success.
Yeah, thank you for that, Anna. It was really cool to read. Then the last of the listener feedback for this episode we have is an email from Max. And they say, "Hi, I hope this email reaches you at an amazing time in your lives. I've been listening to your podcast episodes nonstop since I came across it. Thank you for voicing some of the issues I have been struggling with internally and don't necessarily always know how to talk about, and others I hadn't thought of ever. I'm reaching out to ask for tips on how to start new independent animal liberation groups that are in alignment with values of intersectionality and total liberation. I'm from an area where there isn't really big tradition or culture of organization and or resistance, and people aren't really drawn to activism, even most vegans. Because of that, I think the only groups that ever succeed around here are the more international ones. I think also because they already spread this idea of what proper activism is through popular vegans online that are seen as heroes and such. While I feel ready to get away from AV and most recently animal safe movement to start something that I hope would be more welcoming, I don't really know how to do so and how to explain to other vegans why most of the time. Help, haha. Thank you so much for putting your voices out there and being generally awesome. You really make me feel like I'm not alone or wrong in my radicalism in an already seen as radical movement. Best wishes and hugs, Max."
Hugs back, Max.
Yeah.
What a rad email. What are your thoughts, Pete?
I like where Max's thinking is. I think this is the start of it. To have this idea like you want to create some kind of total liberation group. We will send Max the page from that Greek collective who we mentioned a little earlier, who left AV and started their own anti-speciesist collective. So maybe they can chat and also come up with ideas together. I feel like it's not really something that you have to think too hard about or do too much. I mean, even if it's just you can do stuff. Even if you have like one or two friends interested, you can start a collective and it can just grow from there. I mean, even if you just have like a sticker that you put up everywhere at first, maybe you put on some events. I mean, you can also do street activism without the AV brand or whatever. I mean, there's quite a lot of stuff that you can do. I'm not sure. I feel like I'm kind of waffling here now.
I understand where Max is coming from in terms of not knowing how to speak to other vegans about this. And it sounds like they are still involved with AV and Save movement and stuff like that. So from my perspective, I would say you obviously know some of the activists involved in these groups. So try and create environments or situations where you can sit down and talk to them one-on-one or in a small group of people that you feel like you can relate to in some way, and just be open and honest about how you feel without necessarily dragging anyone down or being overly negative, but rather expressing your concerns about not being kind of overtly for total liberation and how that can marginalize certain groups of people and essentially harm the movement at the end of the day. So I would say the first step from where you're at now is to create dialogue.
Yeah.
Find a few people who you think will be open to the ideas and discuss with them, bounce ideas with them and say, I really like that people here are active in this way, but I think we need to do more. Here's my reason. This is what I'm thinking. What are your thoughts? And kind of have a back and forth with them. So it's a very open discussion and open dialogue where you can encourage them to think more critically about why they're doing activism and how they want that activism to come across and how they want to make an impact.
Yeah, I think a lot of people see our views on these big groups like AV as super negative. And while we are against, like, say with AV, for example, the organization itself, because of the problematic things with the leadership and stuff, we don't have any issues with the activists who are doing it because they want to be active. Like, we've heard from a lot of people in places, AV is the only thing happening in my town. Like, the people involved are not bad people. The people doing cubes and stuff like that, generally, I think, are people just trying to do something and be active. So if I was Max, I think I would maybe at first not just try to get, your focus is to get people to stop doing those things. I would talk about your collective and your idea for collective and your idea for maybe other things to do in addition to what they are doing. So the first approach, I don't know, this is just an idea, is just to say there's someone part of AV, be like, oh, it's cool that you're interested in activism and that you're trying to be active. Would you be interested in doing this with me as well? And then as you get more of a collective forming and more people involved, then you can question when we're doing cubes and street outreach, why does it have to be under this brand? Is it not a mission that we have to create tallies and we have to buy the merch and stuff, that we have to constantly defend silly shits that the leaders are saying and stuff, and can't we just do it ourselves? But I think there can be kind of a danger in isolating yourself if you are in an area where, Max says, it's only big organizations that are active there. If you're going to cut yourself off from that whole community, you know what I mean? Because I think most of those people probably do have their hearts in the right place and want to just be doing activism. I don't know. It's just an idea.
I agree with you, and I think that's also why I was saying have an open dialogue where you're not trying to drag anyone down that you're working alongside, but rather just share your ideas with them, because knowledge is pointless if you're not sharing it. So it's all fair and well to question these things for yourself, but if you're not helping others to question it, then what are you doing? If you're just holding these ideas close to you and thinking, I need to do something different, yeah, that's great, but it will be much more powerful if you share those ideas and get other people to start thinking critically as well. And I think, you mentioned our critiques of AV specifically and how we have issues with their specific leadership and specific things they've done. And I think it's also important to contrast that with groups like the Save movement, where we have also had critical discussions about them and we've critiqued them and we've made points about what we see as beneficial and not beneficial. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two, because on the one hand, you've got a very problematic organization with overtly problematic so-called leaders, and then another organization who we can question the tactics of.
Yeah, it's more the tactics than the group itself.
Yes, and it's not necessarily problematic, but I think it's worthwhile to look at how impactful it is or how we can make it more impactful. So we were actually speaking the other day, myself and Pete, about the value of the Save movement, and if we were to go to another vigil again, how we could bring some other politics into it, how we could make it more effective. Could we make it more of a big protest where we're getting media attention there and we're getting some other forms of activism alongside the vigil itself, so you're not just going there to get footage, and that's not the focus of it necessarily, it's part of it. So things like that, I think it's important to look at. What action are you criticizing? Are you criticizing the individuals and problematic behavior or oppressive behavior, or are you just looking at the tactics and how you can improve it? Because then I think you can also, if you are involved in the Save movement, for example, start speaking to those people and say, how can we make these actions better? Even if it's, I still don't really see the value in having this international branding or whatever. I guess you can benefit from the support of working with other groups overseas, but it's not necessary to be under the same branding. But at the same time, you can also sometimes just improve what you're doing.
Yeah. And, you know, like, I don't even know who the leadership of the Save movement is. You know, and as far as I know, like, if you don't know who those people are, then you aren't going to be seeing videos of them saying, like, sexist and ableist stuff or, like, super anti-feminist, misogynistic stuff. So I don't see an issue with, like you said, getting involved with the Animal Save movement. It's not the same, like, realm as, I would say, AV is as an organization. But yeah, we also are critical of vigils just for, like, the sake of being there, because it actually can lead to burnout and is traumatic to see these animals just going to slaughter and you are just documenting them. We don't really see the benefit in, like, giving them so-called love or whatever before they are led to be killed. So that's what Taryn and I were talking about, was should we combine it? Like Taryn said, you know, like, if there's a slaughterhouse, why not have a loud protest outside of it where maybe there's something that you can shut down, or, like, you can stop a truck or something like that, where, like, the vigil is kind of part of something else. Not just in itself this, in my opinion, like, super submissive thing of, like, going to slaughterhouse and then just traumatizing yourself, documenting it. And often the Save groups, like including the one here, go back multiple times to the same slaughterhouses. I don't really get that. Like, once you've been there and you have the footage and photos and stuff of one place, then you can see how they operate.
Although, and we have discussed this before in previous episodes, so we won't go too much into it, but like we've mentioned, there are also potential welfare cases that could be open, which is debatable how effective that is. But, you know, I think it also, there is a place for putting pressure on one specific place and just being an irritation to them. And I think there's value in that as well, as much as, you know, when you talk about, like, ALF strategies and stuff, you talk about economic damage or specific liberations. But I think personally, agitation is very important as well.
Yeah, it is.
Make them uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think there's value in that, but with the considerations that we've mentioned previously.
Yeah, and I mean, if it's possible to even, you know, if, like Max is saying, you want to start a total liberation group, find out about the conditions for the workers in the slaughterhouses and then include that in your protest too. Like, there's no problem with going to a slaughterhouse to protest that as part of, like, a problem with animal agriculture, that's, like, undocumented immigrants could be working there and get terrible wages and terrible working conditions, and that's something worth protesting too, and worth not that you can document something like that because you'd have to be inside, but it's something that you could include in a more consistent anti-oppression, like total liberation protest outside of a slaughterhouse.
Yeah. And just as a last quick point, you raised something that I think is actually quite important, Pete, is that when you look at the organizations, just the two examples we're using, AV and Save Movement, I think it's actually really important that you say you don't know who the leaders of Save Movement are, and I don't either. I mean, you can identify people who have started specific chapters, but I think it says a lot about the organization when you have these, like, celebrity type leaders versus people that nobody knows the names of. And I think that in itself speaks volumes.
Yeah.
Because if you have these leaders that are in the public eye saying often very problematic things.
Like calling someone a dumb fuck.
Yes,
Direct
which Paul
quotes
from AV
from
did.
Paul Basher, yeah.
Yes, for being called out for, ironically, being ableist. Anyway, so that says a lot. It's like, if you've got these people trying to be these celebrity activists running the so-called biggest animal rights organization in the world, most effective this, most that, it's like, sounds like the introduction to a reality TV show, you know, versus Save Movement, who nobody knows who started it. Well, I say nobody. They're not well known.
Yeah.
So
thanks, Max. Good luck with everything you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for the email, and feel free to message us anytime if you feel like you have thoughts you want to share. And on that note, it's time for
It's time for the bad and the rad.
So our first bad for today is the fires in Australia.
Yeah, really devastating.
Yeah, I don't even really have words to say too much about it, but everybody knows. about the devastation at the moment because of the bushfires. We're actually not going to go into too much detail about this because we're thinking of doing a full episode unpacking a lot of the issues related to the bushfires or issues that have been brought to the fore because of what's happening there. So we're going to leave links in the show notes to places that you can donate to because we think that's really important. And the devastation doesn't stop when the fires are out. I think that's a really important point to note because there's a shortage of food, there's a shortage of water for the surviving free roaming animals, and there's so much that needs to be rebuilt. So I'm sure it's going to be a pretty relentless struggle for a while for a lot of people and organizations affected trying to help wild animals especially. So
with wild animals, but as well as the humans that live in Australia. So it's really devastating. A quick point is that I've been finding it intensely annoying and frustrating with people using it as a way to push a vegan message like, oh, you should be vegan if you care about these animals. If you cut your arm off by mistake, like, you need to deal with that immediately because that is the current crisis happening. You aren't going to sit there and be told how you should take vitamins and drink water when your crisis is that your arm has been cut off. Right now, Australia is on fire and it's devastating for all the people and animals affected, almost 500 million animals. And so it's really shit to make people feel shame for caring. It's really irritating to me. Like, it's really cool that people care, even people who aren't vegan. And we should be saying, it's cool that you care, and then maybe add on to that you're vegan. Don't come at it from this approach of you're a hypocrite because you care about this and you aren't vegan. That's not helping anybody. Yeah,
and I think it's important to think about sensitivity and timing. Like, I understand the need to, or the desire to highlight the hypocrisy of, 500 million animals are affected. This is so sad. And kind of pointing out the inconsistency in that care versus not caring about the animals who are killed daily for consumption and other uses. But timing. People going vegan right now are not going to put out fires. People getting active because they care right now is what will put out fires and help animals in need right now.
Exactly.
So it is an important point and comparison to highlight when the time is right.
Yeah, let's put out the fires and then let's talk about it.
Yeah.
But in a way that's like, it's really cool that you care about koala bears. Have you heard about what happens to cows, for example? Like, in a way that rewards the compassion they have. You know what I mean? Even if people only care about dogs and cats, be like, oh, it's so cool that you care about dogs and cats. Not like so hypocritical that you care about dogs and cats. But there's ways to say things. But like we said, this is urgent right now. So figure out how you can be active, who you can donate to. There's tons of stuff on Instagram about it and all over social media. So, yeah. I mean, it's like actually really intense. Like, the fires are massive, really massive. And it's affecting places like New Zealand and even Chile, which is like 12,000 kilometers away.
Yeah, but like we said, we are probably going to do a full episode on this because it's not just about the immediate fires and the immediate devastation, but there are a lot of issues that have come up because of this that we think are worth discussing, even if it seems a little bit dated, I guess.
By the time the episode comes out.
By the time we record it. So
there are probably a lot of other bads we could speak about right now, like Trump's antics and a bunch of other stuff that like actually is an overwhelming list of things. But should we move on to rads?
Yeah, so we wanted to just mention the Animal Voices podcast, which is a Canada-based radio show / podcast about animal advocacy and veganism. And we'll put links in the show notes as always. But they recently did a really cool interview with AFCO about her new book entitled Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, A Guide to Getting Out. And we'd highly recommend giving it a listen. It was a really cool episode. And AFCO is just amazing to listen to. Her ideas are amazing. And we also are both really keen to get her new book. So if anyone's feeling really generous and wants to send us each a copy, we'd be super stoked.
Yeah, and we also highly recommend reading the other book she wrote with her sister Syl called Afroism.
Yeah.
So the podcast episode title that Taryn mentioned is AFCO on Speciesism as an Extension of White Supremacy. So one thing I found really interesting, I mean, I don't want to ruin the whole episode. People should go listen to it. But one point that I personally found really interesting were the points she made about intersectionality. And I actually agree with her and the points she made. So to quote from the interview, she says, "Intersectionality is literally just one theoretical framework of many. It's a legal framework developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it was designed to make Black women visible in this legal structure." So what the example that Kimberly Crenshaw uses is, say a Black woman goes to a company to apply for a job and she doesn't get hired. And then if she sees it as a way that she's being discriminated against, they can say something like, "But we employ Black people and we employ females, so we can't be discriminating against you." Not mentioning that they only employ Black men and white females. So that is a unique oppression that a Black woman would sit in there. You know what I mean? So that is what she used to describe intersectionality. F goes on to say, "That term was really attractive to social justice movements because it provided language for this feeling we had. We knew a lot of things were happening at one time in terms of oppression, but we didn't know how to articulate it. And so a lot of activists kind of borrowed that term, took it out of its legal context, which was supposed to be about Black women, and started using, quote, intersectional as a synonym for any connection, for any oppression. To a certain extent, I think that's okay. I think it's an attractive, seductive term. I think it makes sense, except that it has a lot of gaps, even in terms of how it's applied towards Black women. The problem is now animal rights activists are taking this framework that was supposed to be about Black women, that already had a ton of gaps, and now they're just throwing animals into the mix. And so now today in social justice movements, everyone is talking about 100 oppressions at one time, and it's confusing. And sometimes it's not accurate. In my book, I go into talking about how intersectionality specifically ignores Black men's situations. And I just really don't think it's an appropriate framework to talk about animals, and I offer something different, which is multidimensional theory. So essentially, F is saying what we all mean when we talk about intersectionality, but I agree with her that we could be using better terms, such as collective liberation or total liberation. And I don't know if we should actually be using the term intersectional to describe a stance or position at all. When it is much more about a specific context and situation, as she mentions, and I personally am not going to use the term anymore because of what she's said and the points that she's made. I think we can recognize intersectional oppression, but now it sounds weird to me to describe yourself as like an intersectional or as intersectional. So I'm excited to get the book and read about her concept of multidimensional theory, which is, I think, probably a more accurate way of describing what we mean when we say intersectional or when we talk about intersectionality. She also talks about how she sees it as an issue that the animal rights movement is becoming less about talking to people about animals and understanding animal oppression, and more about getting people to identify as vegan and eat a vegan diet. And she's also critical of the corporatization that happens within veganism and the massive organizations and stuff. And I also like that she talks about the importance of reading, learning, listening, and talking to people outside of the animal rights movement, such as the anti-racist movement, and that the animal rights movement thinks that they're the only one who cares about this issue or these issues when that just isn't the case. So to quote her one more time, she said, "I don't think that one movement alone is going to solve the problem," which I agree with. So I find the interview, even though it's quite short, like a very powerful, inspiring interview.
Yeah, definitely. And I think those are all really valid points. And I agree about using the term intersectional. And I agree with what you were saying about it being weird to have it as like an identity. Because to me, even when it's framed that way, even when it's like you hear someone say like, "I'm an intersectional vegan," it sounds like an identity. But to me, the meaning should be, I'm a vegan who understands intersectionality. And it's been kind of like co-opted as this thing as like, I'm now this thing.
Yeah.
More than I am a person who understands these intersecting issues.
Yeah. But I also agree with her that with the gaps it has, and with the fact that it was originally intended by Kimberly Crenshaw as just describing like a Black woman situation, that it's actually not an appropriate term or like the best term or most effective term for us to be using for what we all mean when we talk about intersectionality.
Yeah, and like she said, it kind of muddies the waters for all of these issues, essentially. So it's better to just be clear about what you're talking about and use intersectionality as it was intended.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was getting at. So
Yeah.
we'll post a link to that in the show notes, as Taryn mentioned. But should we move on to the main discussion, our short film reviews?
So we wanted to talk about 2 new documentaries which kind of differ from the usual vegan documentaries that many of us have seen and which are often used as kind of recommendations for non-vegans and that kind of thing. So we thought these were cool because they differ a little bit from those usual documentaries. So first off, we watched and wanted to discuss briefly The Invisible Vegan.
So The Invisible Vegan is an independent documentary that explores the problem of unhealthy dietary patterns in the African American community, foregrounding the health and wellness possibilities enabled by plant-based vegan diets and lifestyle choices. The film interweaves the personal narrative of Yasmin Leva, a 30-year-old black actress and filmmaker, with the professional and personal experiences of a prominent group of vegan activists. The film integrates interviews with popular culture luminaries, including Cedric the Entertainer, John Sally, who's a former NBA player and wellness advocate, and Clayton Gavin, who I didn't know this was his real name, but that's Stick from Dead Prez.
Yeah, I think most people just know him as Stick from Dead Prez.
So you can hire or purchase it on Vimeo, and we did that and watched it.
Yeah, so overall, I think this was a really important documentary. There's a lot of really good messaging that is generally left completely out of the discussion in most vegan documentaries. And they feature a variety of different people like Christopher Sebastian, Lauren Ornelas from Food Empowerment Project, Abreeze Harper, Dr. Milton Mills, and they also make mention of like Rosa Parks and Angela Davis. And I actually didn't know Rosa Parks was vegetarian.
No, I didn't either.
Which is quite cool.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
So, yeah, they speak to a lot of really great activists that I don't think get enough exposure in the mainstream kind of vegan movement. And I think a lot of the issues that they raise are often completely overlooked.
Yeah, most likely because they aren't white.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it was really cool to see things from a non-white perspective, and there's a lot of really interesting history. And I think they make a really important distinction between like white veganism and black veganism. Because black people really are not represented in the mainstream vegan movement.
Yeah.
And, people can see that as maybe including your like politics and the animals don't care if you're black or white or whatever. It is really important to talk about it because if you don't allow people to attach that, say like, they're speaking about black veganism, then you're essentially doing the same thing as when white people talk about being colorblind. And you're ignoring the individual experience of vegans who are black, which is different from the individual experience of vegans who are white.
Yeah, definitely. So very, very quick critiques. The first one to me was that there were a few too many images of flesh. It was a lot.
There's like a lot of really close-ups of cooking meat, like animal flesh.
Yeah, which is not great. And some of the editing was not great. Like who was it? Carter? David Carter? Is his name?
I think David Carter.
David Carter. He has this very short clip which nearly had a heart attack because it was like suddenly so loud. I mean, we're nitpicking here, but it's just like the editing wasn't amazing. So it would have just been cool to see them get some funding.
Yeah,
just to tweak it a little bit. But
maybe some of that Earthling Ed money.
Yeah.
Or the
Game Changers money.
Yeah, that What the Health or Cowspiracy or $1 Million Vegan money.
Yeah. But mainly it was just that I think that I understand why they showed a lot of footage of like animal products, but it was a lot all the time.
It's kind of hard to see. And then the only other critique I had was that the like handle, the Invisible Vegan, was in the bottom left corner the whole time, which for some reason I found it a little distracting. But really, like, those are the only critiques I have.
And the other thing is that so like you say, the Invisible Vegan handle was there all the time, but all of the interviewees got a very brief show of their name and what they do, to the point where I was making a couple of notes as we were watching because I wanted to remember who said what and who was in there, and I found the names flash quite quickly, and what they do. And I feel like if you're not familiar with the people, you would kind of miss who they are and what they do. And I think there were so many really cool projects that were mentioned, and it was like on the screen and gone. And then the person would speak again and they wouldn't be like reintroduced. So that little handle was there constantly, but the individual interviewees were only mentioned, like their name was only shown once. So like if you didn't get it the first time, you wouldn't know who they are. So, I mean, also that's a very small criticism, but I think it would have been nice to just have their name there every time they were speaking so that people not familiar with the work could get to know those names a little bit easier. That's, again, a silly thing to criticize, but it was just something that I would have thought would be cool just to give them more, like...
Yeah, if anything that we're criticizing.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it was a really good documentary that I would really highly recommend people watch.
We thought we would just add a couple of key points from the documentary. Obviously, we think you should just watch it, so hopefully these won't be spoilers if you haven't seen it, but just watch it anyway.
Actually, just don't. You shouldn't be listening if you haven't seen it.
We probably should have said that in the beginning.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert. So one point is that for me, I found it quite diet-centric, which I understand because they say it is focusing on like...
Yeah. I mean, it's in the description.
Yeah. But it is just quite diet-centric. But they do speak a lot about like racism and the racism inherent in the food systems and challenging the notion of veganism as a kind of white thing. They also mention the fact that like African Americans are more likely to be diabetic. They're more likely to die from breast cancer and heart disease. And this, while it's health and diet focused, also speaks a lot to the racism in our food systems and things like access to and distribution of healthy food. So I think that's really important, the way that they put that across.
So they do speak quite a bit about institutional racism and food racism, food deserts, like that kind of stuff that if you haven't heard of those things, it's really worth looking up and educating yourself about. Yeah.
And related to this kind of mainstream idea of white veganism and, you know, white people, well, I guess a mainstream idea in any movement really is this idea that white people kind of lead the way, which is so ridiculous. And I really like that Breeze Harper highlighted at one point that there's this kind of colonial or like missionary approach to food, where there's a kind of narrative of like teach them being people of color to eat better.
Yeah, I think is that what she calls the white man's burden in the documentary?
It might have been there that she said that.
Maybe I'm misremembering how she used that term, but it is like this like condescending, like top-down missionary approach of like, we know how to eat well and look after things. This is what you should do.
Yeah, it kind of puts this message across that like people of color are not capable of making healthy choices, which is ridiculous. So it highlights the fact that people of color are very much capable of making healthy choices for themselves. And this whole white savior narrative that tries to essentially control black bodies and tell them what to do is super belittling and ignores like all these systemic factors at play when it comes to access to foods.
Yeah, and she talks about how there's always this emphasis put on individuals when the causes of the issues are often systemic. And that speaks a lot to consumerism in general and what capitalism does by saying like, oh, you know, to save water, like you need to shower less and you need to water your garden less and you need to do this and you need to do this. Like, what about the fucking companies and institutions and systems that are way more to blame and have way bigger impact? But I mean, it's a tool to use, and in the same way that like it's always this emphasis like, yeah, you need to eat better, whatever, but what if food is just not accessible? You know, it's the systems that are to blame more than the individuals who like can only afford to eat cheap junk like from McDonald's or something.
Yeah, exactly.
I also like that she talks about research on representation that she did in portrayals of how vegans are supposed to look or whatever, through looking at media campaigns of the perfect vegan body as being mostly white or light-skinned, skinny, able-bodied, etc. And there's really not much space or representation of like the majority of people in the world, you know, which I thought was a really good point.
Yeah, and also Lauren Ornelas from Food Empowerment Project also spoke a little bit about capitalism, and she mentions food deserts and the way that capitalism exploits humans and non-human animals.
Yeah, Food Empowerment Project is a really important organization. And they have this tagline that I really like: just because it's vegan doesn't mean it's cruelty-free. So to me, that's like, they're a really good example of an organization that's consistently anti-oppression.
Yeah.
I think they played a clip from her doing a talk somewhere else where she talks about capitalism as this like really harmful system. She mentions finding it offensive to compare slavery to animal exploitation, which I thought was interesting, and it's something that bugs me a lot too. And she mentions how the mainstream vegan movement only seems to care about, quote, not us, which I thought is a really good point.
Yeah, I also found that very powerful. Then just another kind of side note about the documentary itself. There is some footage of animals being killed, because I know a lot of people want to know if there's going to be graphic footage. There is a little bit, but the focus is, even in this, largely on like diseases and contamination of animal flesh and things like that. So it's still very diet focused, but I do think that in a way that does kind of bring in some ethics. Although, I mean, obviously the discussions around racism and stuff is ethics as well, but animal rights ethics, yeah.
Yeah, and there is footage that's really hard to watch of animals being slaughtered and stuff, like you said,
yeah.
in slaughterhouses.
But it's not a lot. I mean, if you don't want to see graphic footage, I would still say definitely watch, but you'll kind of see when the graphic footage is coming, and then you can kind of just look away for a minute and it's done.
Another thing that Breeze Harper said was that how privileged and ignorant it is to tell people to focus on saving animals only, which makes invisible their material struggles.
Yeah, I thought that was a really important point as well. And I kind of wish a lot of the mainstream big vegan organizations would listen to that, because there's a lot of this kind of minimizing of those kind of struggles where it's people saying, oh, it's easy to go vegan, but you're ignoring like a lot of the barriers that are there for a lot of people.
And then it does come across as super privileged and ignorant, because you are ignoring their material struggles as human beings. And it's one of the reasons why it's essential, if you're going to achieve animal liberation, that you need to be including human struggles and talking about collective liberation.
And then another point, we mentioned it briefly earlier, but Christopher Sebastian specifically said that he struggled when he went vegan because he wasn't seeing himself represented. So it was seen as this kind of like elitist thing only available to some, which is a huge problem. And I think that was such a good point, is that I wonder how many other people feel that, like they can identify with the politics of animal liberation, but the movement, the vegan movement, is not representative of them. And you're seeing all these like Breeze Harper said, these skinny, fit white people, and you see that as veganism, and you see it as something that you can't be part of because you're not represented there.
Yeah. And I thought one thing I really liked about the documentary was that it really doesn't overpromise veganism.
Yeah.
Even in the little things that come up where they say what a vegan diet can do for you and stuff, it really doesn't overpromise it. Like the one thing said, it's been shown to have potential benefits to help with this or whatever. They're not saying like go vegan and you'll get ripped or something, or go vegan and you won't have any diseases or something like that.
Yeah.
You mentioned organizations earlier that came up. I thought one that I personally found really inspiring was that Soilful City one.
Yes.
Where they're growing community gardens and stuff like in poor neighborhoods, and access to healthy foods and things like that.
Yeah, we'll actually link to some of the organizations and people that were mentioned in the documentary. So obviously watch the documentary, but we'll also put links there for people within the documentary that we think would be cool to support.
Yeah. And I think it's really important in how it shows how animal and human rights really intersect, and that they are both really important things to tackle if we're going to achieve animal liberation and hopefully try to achieve total liberation.
Yeah.
And I really liked as well, the last point I have to make is that when they talk about health, specifically Christopher Sebastian and Stick from Dead Prez, they do speak about health, but not in a kind of selfish way. It's like, to quote Christopher Sebastian, he says, having a healthy body is political. And Stick talks about that too. I mean, you can also hear it in the songs, like, for example, his section in the song Which Side Are You On by Rebel Diaz is like, the lyrics are about that, like being healthy and disciplined and stuff like that, but in a political way. It's not at all about just want to look good or anything like that. And then he also mentions like getting angry at the gendering of food, which I thought was really good. Yeah, and then also how black people and people of color are often told that they can't care about animals because that takes away from black liberation, but that is a white supremacist lie. So I think the most powerful quote to me that came out of the documentary was by Christopher Sebastian, where he said, "We're compelled to care about more than one thing. Black liberation, queer liberation, and animal liberation are all linked."
Yeah, I thought that was great as well. So overall, I think Invisible Vegan is a really good documentary, definitely worth checking out. So we'll leave links, as we said, and give it a watch.
Yeah.
So the next documentary that we wanted to discuss is The Animal People. And if you haven't heard of it, it's a documentary about the story of 6 of the activists that were trying to shut down Huntingdon Life Sciences, which is one of the largest animal testing labs. And it covers the series of events that took place during the Stop Huntingdon animal cruelty campaign and trial, so the SHAC campaign. And we're going to discuss some of the aspects of the documentary that stood out for us. So if you haven't watched it yet, you might want to watch it before you listen.
Yeah, so just as a general impression, I thought the documentary was really well edited, and it has a great soundtrack that you don't really notice it, but it adds a lot to the mood of the documentary.
Yeah, and there was quite a variety of footage because it was done over a long period of time. So there was some older footage, but even so, like you said, the editing was really good. So the whole flow of the documentary and the way it was put together was really, really good. So just for some context, the documentary focuses on Huntingdon Life Sciences, and this company was especially unethical. I mean, all research and testing on non-human animals is unethical, but they would test on any kind of consumer products. It didn't have to be for like medical research or anything. So it was like really egregious, horrible cruelty going on.
Yeah, like any company that makes consumer products could outsource to them to test their product on animals, and it's literally like every product you can think of that's a consumer product.
So basically the documentary goes through a lot of the tactics that we used, a lot of what happened during the time, and it focuses a lot on the individual activists as well and their views and stuff. And one thing that stood out to me quite early on, which is kind of it's a small point, but I just found it interesting. One of the SHAC activists, Kevin Jonas, says at one point that he believes in hierarchy and leadership. And I just found that quite an interesting point because in general, the other footage and the other discussions all seems to have this very non-hierarchical structure and kind of mode of activism. So I just found that quite interesting.
Yeah,
that they included that.
I watched it twice and I didn't even notice that the first time I watched it. It's like kind of said in passing as he leaves the shot.
Yeah.
You know? And I think maybe it just came out of this place of frustration. I personally have heard of a few people that I know and have met traveling say things like that, kind of out of frustration, just because things can feel super urgent and non-hierarchical, like consensus decision making can take a lot of time, and it can be frustrating to like organize, say, like 7 people to be all on the same page. But I mean, like you said, that like the SHAC 7 had no hierarchy, and a lot of the people in it talk about this like non-hierarchy, and so it does seem contradictory, but I don't really know why they put that in there.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned it, because it's also not just the SHAC 7. Like there were a lot of activists involved all over the place, and there was no one telling them what to do. Like they could take ownership of whatever they felt comfortable doing, which I think was a really cool part of the campaign, is that there were different roles for different people, and whatever they felt comfortable doing, they did, which sometimes had good results and sometimes not so much. But I just found it interesting that they even included that line. I'm not sure why, but it's just an interesting point.
I mean, SHAC had a very similar approach to the ALF, but it was an idea.
Yeah.
And they just invited anyone to do anything, like from very above ground, like safe kind of activism to whatever risk you're willing to take, direct action kind of stuff.
Anything from letter writing to brick throwing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think also watching it, if you're not angry enough with just the idea of animal testing, they also show this employee, Darius Dagar, I think that's how you say his name, but he literally denied the suffering of animals, and they were talking about like the violence and saying that like animal testing is not violent.
Yeah, it's ridiculous because he describes what violence is, like removing the freedom and this and this and this. And he could essentially be describing animal testing. And then the interviewer asks him like, well, do you think that animal testing is violence? And he's like, no.
No, yeah. And he's talking about it in the context of like the protesters outside his home and how it affected his marriage and made his wife feel intimidated and all this stuff. But animal testing is totally fine. And he justifies it by saying like they can feel pain in the moment, but they don't, plan going forward, or they can't anticipate if you say, oh, I'm going to harm your sibling or whatever. They don't have a conceptualization of harm like that. So therefore it's not violence.
And they don't have radios and TV.
Yeah, they haven't developed those kind of technologies. So it's totally fine. Infuriating. Then also another interesting, frustrating point. One of the undercover investigators that was working in the lab said that they got feedback because the shack protest started in the UK, and some of the feedback that fed through to the US lab was don't get caught doing this stuff. Like,
so to the
like
scientists doing the testing.
Like they were in the UK. Like let's not treat animals like shit. Just don't get caught.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But I also thought that's really interesting that, this is the level of seriousness and the type of tactics that the shack campaign and people involved were willing to do, where someone literally got employed by the company to work there to gather footage. That to me is like, I can really respect that. She couldn't do anything while she was in there, but she did gather a lot of footage and information, and like,
I don't know if I'd be able to do that. I think I would flip out at people.
Like fake got hired.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, that's kind of cool. That's like a very respectable thing to do as a tactic.
Yeah, if you can keep your cool enough to do that, sure. I definitely wouldn't be able to. But speaking of footage, there isn't actually a lot of graphic footage either, similar to Invisible Vegan, like very short amount of footage, but it is really difficult to watch. The graphic footage that is there of the animal testing and there's like footage of a dog being punched in the face and a monkey getting essentially vivisected.
A necropsy, right?
It was supposed to be a necropsy, but the animal was still alive and being like cut open.
Yeah,
it was really difficult to watch.
The small amount of graphic footage is extremely intense to watch.
Yeah, and then some other footage, not non-human animal related, there was a fair amount of footage of what the police did. And, aside from the violence and harm inflicted by the actual lab, you also see how the institutions surrounding that industry upholds it. So you see police pepper spraying protesters and hitting protesters, including one of the Shack 7, Josh Harper. And even when you see them getting arrested and taken in to get their mugshots taken and whatever, you see one of the activists stick her tongue out and like give the finger to them while they're taking the photo, and you just hear this voice like, give her 10 days in jail. And it just shows this abuse of power.
Yeah, I think the entire resistance to the Shack campaign was this like overt display of power. From the FBI labeling them as the most dangerous domestic terrorist threats in the US. Like, what?
It's ridiculous.
To the overt display of force by police, like you mentioned, to not allowing them to talk about or show anything from inside of HLS in the court case, which like completely removed context and, like they said, just made them come across like these like belligerent teenagers who were causing trouble.
Yeah, that's an important point, is that if you haven't watched it, one of the huge factors in the trial was that they couldn't show any of that stuff. They couldn't speak about what they saw. And I don't know if that's got to do with the law of like the fact that they got the footage illegally.
I don't know.
But it just shows how these systems uphold each other. Like, if you obtain this footage illegally, you can't use it in court. And it's like, that's saying you have an obligation to disobey unjust laws, but the thing is the law will just uphold itself and be like,
Yeah, exactly.
oh, but you got that illegally, so we're just going to throw it out
Yeah.
of court. So for the jury, they would have seen like these so-called extreme activists or even terrorists bullying these poor employees. And,
Yeah.
a lot of the tactics they were using was, as part of a pressure campaign, they were going outside of individual homes and protesting and, making things really difficult for a lot of people related to HLS. And they were seen as these bullies, essentially.
It's absolutely like mind-boggling to me how they can put these people who are like gentle vegan animal rights people on the same list as like suicide bombers and like people who are committing actual acts of terrorism.
Yeah.
Like how they could be defined as terrorists. It shows like how much power the animal industry has.
And it's wild to me because, talking about how the police and the court and all of that kind of plays into that, it's baffling to me because I guarantee some of the police involved and some of the people, whether it be the jury or the judge or whoever, I'm sure if you ask a lot of those people, are they against like animal cruelty? They would say yes, of course.
Yeah.
Or are you okay with animals being harmed? They would say no. But yet they are enforcing laws and enforcing systems of power that uphold the harms that they would probably say that they're against. And it's just mind-boggling to me the way these systems work.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It's incredibly frustrating.
The whole thing is really frustrating and sad to watch, actually.
Yeah. So we spoke earlier a little bit about the ideas of hierarchy and things like that and the way that activists could kind of do what they felt comfortable with doing. And I think it was good that in the documentary, they also mentioned some mistakes that they made. So I think looking at the documentary now, obviously a lot has changed. So the tactics, even the tactics that worked then might not necessarily work now. And that's obviously important to think about. But I think it's also good to include some of the mistakes they made. Like they mentioned some activists in another, I don't know if it was another part of the country or somewhere else, but they essentially attacked the wrong home and smashed windows or something because they obviously hadn't researched properly. And that is a horrible thing to happen. And they express that there's like regret surrounding that. But the people who did it had good intentions. It was just a mistake. And I think that's bound to happen when you do have people who feel empowered to get involved how they can. So there's this like, it's a toss-up between hierarchy and too much control versus that.
I don't know if they mentioned it as a mistake. It's just like that they're recognizing like the nuance of having something like SHAC, like ALF, where they're going to be sent communiques that they've promised that they will put onto their websites that they won't necessarily agree with. Like Jake mentions at one point that they went for long walks discussing like, should we put this on the website? Because they were like, it's these communiques of things that they didn't really agree with, but that people did in the name of SHAC. So they had to put it up,
But that one incident they did say was a mistake. I think it was Josh Harper that was talking, and he said, obviously they regret that happening because it was literally an innocent person's home that was wrecked.
Yeah, but I'm saying that it's not a mistake of the tactic or a mistake of SHAC.
No, it's a mistake that happened by the activists.
Yeah.
It was a mistake that was made, and they acknowledged that, and I think that's good.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's a mistake of like the structure of the activism.
Yeah, it's just something that can happen when you have such an open, like, horizontally organized like campaign.
But that's why I think it's good that they include it, because they acknowledge like it wasn't perfect. It was a great campaign and it achieved a lot, but they also acknowledge the downfalls. And I think that is important for learning lessons going forward. Like if you are structuring things in this way, bear in mind what can go wrong and try and kind of prepare for that, I guess. So I also thought it was cool that they interviewed Stephen Best, and he mentioned that social change usually has some level of violent support behind it, because people generally talk a lot about violence and the problems with violence, but he speaks about a lot of these social justice movements that everyone hails the kind of peaceful leader, and completely ignores the fact that there was some level of violence involved in a revolution
Yeah.
that is necessary.
Yeah, so he mentions example of like Mahatma Gandhi, who didn't, it wasn't just him that achieved what he achieved, and it wasn't just Martin Luther King who achieved what he achieved. There was Malcolm X and the Black Panthers standing behind him, you know, or the hippie movement that achieved what they achieved with like the Vietnam War. It was the Vietnamese people who kicked the Americans' ass. I think that's the quote that Steve Best says. So hasn't been any like real revolutionary social change that's happened without violence.
And I think that framing violence as this always bad thing also ties into how like the cops and the kind of people in power use that against activism and against social change, like how the cops framed them as these violent, dangerous terrorists, and going to communities and saying like, don't walk outside at night and lock your doors, and like instilling this fear in the community that these people are coming to get you, rather than like, look what they're defending.
I love what Shaq made, that sheet of learn to recognize gang members. And it had like a cop and a judge and whatever else on it. That was really
very
good.
like tongue-in-cheek. And aside from, you know, framing them as these violent criminals and also not allowing them to speak about the actual cause in court, you know, speak about what they found, it's also ridiculous when you hear that part of the trial, they're talking about Kevin Jonas and saying his metaphorical fingerprints were all over this.
Yeah, they speak about how they didn't really do anything. So the FBI and the authorities, I mean, and they even interviewed that one guy who says, we're going to come up with the most creative means possible to pin this on them any way we can.
Yeah, he's essentially saying we're going to twist the law because we want them in jail.
They did like everything they could, including saying that shit's metaphorical fingerprints. What the fuck is a metaphorical fingerprint?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, just really reaching. Yeah, and somehow they got them.
It just shows you like laws and
the legal system.
Yeah, it's all so skewed and biased and oppressive. Then aside from how like kind of unethical the whole trial was and how the activists were treated and everything, it's also really disheartening. You see at the end of the documentary that Brian Cass, the CEO of the UK Huntington, is now the CEO of Invigo. So it's essentially the same company, and they have 50 locations in 14 countries, according to a little speech that he gives at the end. And I found that really like disheartening.
Yeah, it makes you think, wow, like they were trying to close down this one lab in the US, and then this company opened 50 of them.
Yeah, it's like soul destroying.
Yeah, it is really disheartening.
I mean, I find overall the documentary is really inspiring, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and I think that it was a really valuable campaign, and I think what they achieved is admirable and it was important, and I'm glad that was done. But I think it's also cautionary in a lot of ways. So I think it, for me, reinforced the idea that it's really important to have proper planning for any campaign. Like, they were really organized. They did things really thoroughly. But it also shows the importance of assessing risk, realizing the power dynamics at play, realizing the capitalist systems we live in, you know, and learning from these past campaigns. Like, I think a lot of their tactics were really creative and really good, but also, I don't know, maybe they would have done things differently if they knew how it was going to turn out. Like, I actually really liked, you mentioned the how to identify gang members poster. They also had those branded matchboxes with the address of Huntington, which I thought was hilarious.
Yeah.
But in hindsight, they were probably like,
maybe not
that didn't help our case much, you know?
Yeah, but it was inspiring in the tactics they used. Like, for example, in a pressure campaign, going after tertiary targets involved. Like, you know, go after the banks funding the lab, go after the people supplying toilet paper to the lab, go after the company that they outsource to clean it or something like that, and basically shut them down in that way, so you don't directly target the lab only. You also go after everything that helps them run.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is like something that can probably work really well applied even nowadays, like attacking tertiary targets of targets.
Yeah, I think maybe some of the strategies would have to differ because of technology and stuff like that. But I think you're right, because going after the main target, especially a target like this, they have so much power and so much money. They'll get bailouts like they did, and they'll just shut down any efforts to attack them because you're attacking their primary business, and they will defend that with everything they have. But when you're going after tertiary targets, what's useful with that is they have often lots of business, lots of clients. So if you're going after the company that supplies their printing paper, they're not going to like crumble if they give up one client, especially if that client is framing them in a horrible light in the public. So it's easy for tertiary companies to just step away and be like, we don't want anything to do with this.
Yeah, and you make it difficult for them to operate then.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from in watching this documentary. It is very inspiring, but also as Lauren Gazzola says, like, we didn't win because look at how many new labs are open. Animal testing is still going on. So it's really disheartening.
And they serve jail time.
Yeah, especially because the activists served jail time. They gave up so much of their personal freedom, their personal lives. One really heartbreaking thing was Kevin Jonas saying goodbye to his dog before going into prison. That just like destroyed me.
Yeah, I cried.
Oh man, it was so hard. And then the dog like passed away while he was in prison.
Yeah, it does. I
that
felt
just
like
ruined
a mix
me.
of anger and sadness.
Same, soul destroying. So things like that, I feel like a lot of those things, when you look at them, you think, was it really worth it? Especially to those individuals. So again, that's where like risk assessment and stuff comes in, and realizing like the systems we live in are crushingly powerful. So for me, I feel like it seems impossible that we could ever win. Like she said, we didn't win. I don't know how we could win.
Yeah.
I don't know how we can stop animal testing. I don't know how we can tackle any of the industries that are exploitative and oppressive. It seems massive, but I also think it seems impossible to not try, at least.
Yeah, it's this weird thing that I feel all the time as well. It's like the sense of nihilism, like, yeah, probably not going to see animal liberation achieved in my lifetime. I don't know if we will ever achieve it. But there's like a part of me that won't let me like not try fight towards that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't really explain it.
I guess it comes from a sense of justice. Like we all want to see justice and we want to be rid of oppression. And it's like this back and forth of wanting to give up and thinking, but you can't. You cannot give up because there are individuals who really need people to fight for them, and with them.
Yeah, I mean, I often used to say to people when I first went vegan who asked me like, does it really make any difference or anything like that? And I often used to say, and I guess it's the same with the fight, is that like, even if you manage to somehow prove to me that I'm not making a difference, at least I can sleep at night.
Yeah.
And if anything, that's like reason enough,
Yeah, I don't think any kind of proof of not making individual difference is enough to say, well, if I'm not making a big enough difference to make an impact, I should just be complicit. I should just partake in what I know is wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So even if you make no difference whatsoever, at least just knowing you tried is valuable in itself.
Yeah. And it does make a difference, even though it's like this ridiculous conversation of we can make the world vegan and every person makes a difference. And in the greater scheme of things, a lot of the time we don't really make an impact. But the more people who are doing their bit, the more impact there will be. And you have to look at the bigger picture. Like if 1 billion people do something, it will make an impact.
Yeah. It's hard to convince 1 billion people to do something.
Yeah, sure. But at least be one of the people who agree to try.
Yeah. One con that a friend mentioned to me was that they show the name and face of one of the members of the Shack 7 who managed to not get caught and is still at large, which I think is not great, as they're drawing more attention to someone who doesn't need any of that extra attention. So even if they had just said their name but blurred out or like didn't show their face, it would have been a bit better, I think, because the person is like not caught and there's probably like a warrant for them. And while it probably is public record that anyone can find, like, I don't know if it's a helpful thing for their name and face to be shown in a documentary that's being shown by a lot of people. It would probably be in the interest to try keep their profile as low as possible.
Yeah, I agree. Like you say, it probably is pretty easy to find those details, but people are generally also lazy. So like if you just say one other member was never caught and is still on the run,
Yes,
people will be like, oh, okay. But when you've seen someone's face, I mean, what if that's your neighbor? And what if you're watching the documentary, but you're also a piece of shit? And then you're like, whoa, that's my neighbor, phone the cops.
Or if you're a cop watching it.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? And then now this guy's face is going to be more recognizable than it was before the documentary.
I think, like you said, it's just better to keep a lower profile.
Yeah.
And it's not helpful for that.
So I thought that was kind of weird. It would be interesting to find out if there was any discussion around putting them in or not. And then just as the last point, I would say that I would also highly recommend reading Will Potter's book, Green is the New Red, which I read a couple of years ago, which is about this. Like it's about the Shaq campaign. And there's a lot more detail in a book, obviously, than in a documentary. Will Potter also features in the documentary.
Yeah.
So I think that underlying both of these documentaries is this critique of capitalism, essentially. And I think that being critical of and anti-capitalist is essential if we ever hope to achieve animal or total liberation, because the problems here are systemic. Like whether you're talking about food justice and food deserts and environmental racism and animal exploitation and the law, like the problems are systemic and they're part of like the struggle of total liberation. And it's essential, if you even want to achieve just looking at animal liberation, to fight on all these fronts, And I think as Jake Conroy, aka the cranky vegan who was a member of Shaq, says in the documentary, basically we have to stop picking leaves and attack the roots. So to quote something he says close to the end of The Animal People, and I think this sums up the underlying issues tackled in both documentaries really well, alongside Christopher Sebastian's quote that I mentioned, is that he says, Brian Cass, all these people, are they a symptom of a bigger problem? Probably, yeah. But if we want to stop picking away leaves and branches off this tree and dig up the roots of the issues, we're not going to find Chris Christie down there or Brian Cass. We're going to find capitalism and the quest for absolute power. And I thought that was like a very powerful kind of summation quote. And I wish that more documentaries would show why this is happening and not just what is happening, which is what I see when I see like Dominion or Earthlings or these documentaries that are really important. And they show what is going on and they say, what can you do about it? But they don't say, why is it happening? What are the causes of it? Like the root causes, the systemic and institutional reasons for why these things are taking place.
Yeah. And I think especially the fact that he included absolute power, I think is really important, because that is the core of capitalism as well. And like you say, more documentaries need to show the why. And we spoke about this the other day, in that when you look at some of the documentaries, like even Earthlings and stuff like that, where yes, it's important that there are documentaries empowering people to make an individual change and to show the magnitude of what is happening. I think they unknowingly allude to the why when you see these like drone images of like huge amounts of animals and massive farms and things like that. So it's alluding to the why, but ignoring it. Because why are there such massive amounts of animals in one area being exploited? It shows the magnitude of the problem and it gives people this like, wow, this is huge. But then they don't go any further than that. They don't say, look how huge this is why. Capitalism, profit, power. They just say, look how massive it is, you should go vegan.
Yeah.
Which is the problem.
Yeah, exactly. They're showing what is happening, what can you do. Very rarely do I see vegans and documentaries and stuff tackling why it is happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think both great documentaries everyone should watch.
Yeah, and I think we just touched on some kind of random points for both, but we're interested to hear if you've watched them, if there are points that you think we should have mentioned that we didn't. What did you think about them? Let us know your feedback, or if you have any other questions or comments, you know where to find us. Until next time,
love and liberation.